Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought that I would reveal this little video that I found very particularly interesting. And this is going to be a video over the Tyson Fury versus Oleksandr Usyk conversation. And of course, for those of you that have not heard the news, there is a very decent possibility that there could be a unification match between, at least at the current moment in time, the two best heavyweights in the world. And of course, that would be Mr. Tyson Fury and Mr. Oleksandr Usyk. Oleksandr Usyk, I believe, pretty much holds every other heavyweight title. After his 2-in-a-row victories over Mr. AJ Anthony Joshua, he holds every single title except that of the WBC title, which of course is held by Mr. Tyson Fury after beating Deontay Wilder 2 times in a row. So the big question is, would this fight happen? When will this fight happen? Hopefully it happens maybe a little bit later on this year, or if it doesn't happen a little bit later on this year, maybe it could happen somewhere around early on next year, early spring, somewhere around there. But also another question is, when it comes to Mr. Tyson Fury and Oleksandr Usyk, is overall, what would this fight mean for both of their legacies? And in my opinion, it truly would mean a great amount for their legacies, because basically whoever were to win this fight, they would have to be remembered as one of the great fighters of their generation and probably as the best heavyweight of their day. It just is what it is. But Mr. DontesBoxingNation, he's going to explain what he thinks of this fight. And what you're also going to see from Mr. DontesBoxingNation is overall how he does try to degrade certain fighters like that of a Tyson Fury or like that of an Oleksandr Usyk. And overall, because both of these guys have recently talked about retirement, and Dante is basically going to use that as an excuse, as to basically say that that is the reason why he does not believe that either of these fighters are all-time great fighters. Now, maybe if you were going to make the case in point with a Mr. Oleksandr Usyk, that could maybe be a little bit understood, because Oleksandr Usyk, maybe you could say that he does not have the greatest of resumes, at least when you compare him to other all-time great fighters. When it comes down to it, are all-time great fighters. But when it comes to a Mr. Tyson Fury, at least in my opinion, and I've already stated this, if Tyson Fury retired today, in my view, he would be clearly the greatest heavyweight of his era, the best heavyweight of his era, and the best and the greatest heavyweight ever since that of Lennox Lewis. And on top of that, when it comes down to it, he would be a first ballot Hall of Famer. Now, there's a certain amount of people even on my channel that have tended to disagree with me on that. Listen, what I'll say is this, and I've already stated this. If you have certain fighters like an Andre S.O.G. Ward, if you have certain fighters like overall a Joe Calzaghe, if you have certain fighters maybe like that of a Tommy Hearns, if you have fighters like that on your all-time great list, in my opinion, overall Tyson Fury does deserve also to be somewhat within that conversation. Okay, so it just is what it is. Now, some of you may believe that some of those fighters have bigger wins within their career. We could discuss that, at least comparing, which one individually. But Tyson Fury is somewhere within that ranking. It just is what it is. That, in my opinion, is where he ranks. But anyways, Mr. DontesBoxingNation, he's going to talk about it. And you're going to see, overall, the way that he tries to degrade these two fighters. Pretty much because they're both Caucasian. But it just is what it is. Anyway, let's tune in. Let's see what he has to say.
DontesBoxingNation, what's going on, guys? So as expected, Tyson Fury, he wastes no time to make the Usyk fight. As you guys seen in that tweet, Tyson Fury has already told his promoters, go ahead and make the fight. So clearly this fight is going to happen. I mean, it makes too much sense. It's a really big fight. But the only problem with this fight is no matter who wins this fight, both of them have said that they will retire after they fight against each other. That means they're not going to build a legacy in terms of trying to become one of the greatest heavyweights of all time. Now,
and you basically heard DontesBoxingNation right there. He said they're not trying to build a legacy as debatably the greatest heavyweight of all time. In my opinion, Tyson Fury does not necessarily need to be remembered, because in my opinion, who would win this fight? More than likely, it would be that of a Tyson Fury. I just think that both him and Oleksandr Usyk are not only A-grade fighters, but they both overall have a great amount of skill and boxing intellect, and Fury is going to be significantly bigger. It just is what it is, and he can handle a smaller man much better than that overall, more than likely, of a Deontay Wilder or an Anthony Joshua. So, specifically in Anthony Joshua. So it just is what it is. But anyway.
Surely the winner.
But you notice all in all that Dante, the way that he said it, he said, well, these guys, basically, they'll never have a legacy. Because Dante does not want these two to be remembered as debatably the greatest heavyweight of all time. He does not want them to be remembered as that. Even if they were to defend their titles overall over a certain amount of these other contenders within these next 10 years or within these next several years, all he would basically say is the same thing that he said with Mr. Canelo Alvarez. Well, overall, we can't put him on the same level as some of these other guys because is it on the same level as when Sugar Ray Leonard beat Roberto Duran or Tommy Hearns or all this other shit? So, once again, and I've already said this about Mr. Dante's Boxing Nation's channel and a lot of the LDBC and new media channels as well, and it's not just them overall who operate like this either, because the majority of people in sports operate on a very emotional level when it comes down to it. So this is really nothing new. The majority of people in sports are very, very big fanboys, and that really ruins their logic and objectivity. But it just is what it is. Tyson Fury, very clearly, in my opinion, not only is a very decent fighter and a highly skilled fighter, he is one of the greatest fighters that I've personally ever seen, and certainly is one of the greater heavyweight fighters. And we're going to be talking about, in my opinion, where he necessarily deserves to be ranked. And we're going to talk about that. But anyways, let's tune in some more.
This fight will be the best heavyweight temporarily. And that would be very short term because none of the greatest heavyweights have ever won the title and didn't defend their title against multiple dangerous young top contenders. Some undefeated, some just dangerous. And regardless of...
Well, I understand what you're saying, Mr. Dante, but there's also a certain amount of the heavyweights within the heavyweights division, at least if we're comparing certain ones. Let's compare Tyson Fury to some of the fighters throughout the heavyweight division. Now, if we're comparing him to that of a Muhammad Ali, maybe you think that that is a little bit too much because Muhammad Ali, not only because of his talent level, but because he beat George Foreman, Joe Frazier, Sonny Liston, Ken Norton, and a couple of others. And, who the hell is that one dude trained by Cus D'Amato? Floyd Patterson. Maybe because he beat those guys, maybe in your opinion, it's a little bit, too much of a resume. I would get that. And if we're going to compare Rocky Marciano, who was undefeated and probably the best heavyweight of his day, listen, I would get that. And then that leaves only one other name, in my opinion, within the greatest of all time conversation for the heavyweight division, which is Lennox Lewis, or Lennox Lewis, however you pronounce his name, who, of course, beat Mike Tyson when he was a bit older, beat Evander Holyfield, and beat maybe a couple of other names that I'm not personally remembering. But let's truly overall go over some of the bigger names within some of these guys' careers. How many real A-grade wins in their careers, especially within the heavyweight division, do these guys have? It just is what it is. Muhammad Ali, of course, his resume is a little bit different compared to most others. He was able to beat Sonny Liston. He was able to beat George Foreman. He was able to beat Joe Frazier. He was overall able to beat Floyd Patterson. A lot of those guys, every single one of the guys that I just mentioned, a lot of people would call every single one of those heavyweights all-time great fighters, at least debatably. But if we were to even take a look at Lennox Lewis's career, how many all-time great fighters did Lennox Lewis really beat? Of course, he was able to beat Mike Tyson when Mike Tyson was pretty much older. Now, it was still a fight that, was looked at as very, very decent. But Mike Tyson really was not the same Tyson that he was back in the 80s and really even within the 90s. It just is what it is. They did not fight, I believe, until about 2003. When Lennox Lewis fought that of an Evander Holyfield. I believe Holyfield at that point, that was when he was coming off of the wins over Mike Tyson. He already had a few losses in his career. Now, that was an Evander Holyfield, in my opinion, that pretty much was going to be at a career best, at least debatably. So Lennox Lewis, in my opinion, deserves a great amount of credit. And of course, he ended up defeating Vitaly Klitschko. But other than those three names, how many A-grade wins does he really have in his career? So Dante is trying to make this point that to be on the all-time great heavyweight list, that you have to defend your title over and over and over and over again. And all that is fantastic. And I understand to a degree where he's coming from. But the thing that really needs to mainly be judged is what fighters did you really face, especially for your generation. And if Tyson Fury is able to have Deontay Wilder, who was undefeated when he beat them, Vladimir Klitschko, who was at the top of his game when he beat him, and also Oleksandr Usyk, who was also at the top of his game when he beat them. And maybe, let's just say, adding on Anthony Joshua as well, if he's able to defeat all those guys, Tyson Fury will have a conversation as debatably the greatest heavyweight of all time. It just is what it is. Now, right now, I would not necessarily put him there, but Tyson Fury certainly is one of the greater heavyweights of all time. Because if we really take a look at a lot of the heavyweights throughout history, how many 100% all-time great wins do they truly have on their resume, really? If we're talking about Muhammad Ali, he's a little bit different, but compared to a lot of the other heavyweights who are just below Muhammad Ali probably in terms of their resume for the era, maybe they have, 2, 3, maybe 4 all-time great wins at max. Tyson Fury already has 2 all-time great wins in my opinion, or 2 wins that, in my view, were real 50-50 matchups. The bell of the ball type of matchups. Those are the matchups that I'm talking about. So Tyson Fury has already had 2 of those. If he's able to defeat Oleksandr Usyk, that will be the 3rd one, because that'll be for the complete unification. And if he ends up beating Anthony Joshua, you might be able to count that one as well. So it just is what it is. So how many big wins do heavyweights really need to at least be in the debatable all-time great conversation? Because if we're going to compare Tyson Fury to a lot of other heavyweights, once again, if you don't want to compare him to Muhammad Ali, I don't think that that's necessarily a problem. If you don't even want to compare him to Rocky Marciano or Lennox Lewis, I don't even think that that would be a problem. But if we're going to compare him to a Mike Tyson or an Evander Holyfield, or let's say all in all, a Joe Frazier, a George Foreman, one of those guys, yes, you absolutely could compare Tyson Fury to those guys. And in fact, to be quite honest with you, every single one of those heavyweights that I just mentioned, Tyson Fury is probably ahead of them. Not only is he undefeated when it comes down to it, he has a few very, very great wins in his career. He has a multitude of very great wins in his career. He's very crafty when it comes down to it. And on top of that, he has very high boxing IQ. He is one of the more skilled heavyweights of all time. It just is what it is.
You think these fantasy matches would play out. This is the reason why you cannot compare a Tyson Fury or an Usyk to the actual greats. Tyson Fury is no Lennox Lewis in terms of skill or resume. Tyson is not...
And you hear Mr. Dante say that Tyson Fury is no Lennox Lewis in terms of skill nor resume. But once again, when we actually take a look at things logically and objectively, you can say that Tyson Fury, in my view, is somewhat right there. Now, if you wanted to put Lennox Lewis over him, I wouldn't necessarily have a problem with it. Or Lennox Lewis, once again, however you pronounce his name. I believe maybe the second one might have been more appropriate. But at the end of the day, if you wanted to put Fury over Mr. Lewis, if you wanted to put Lewis over Mr. Fury, I wouldn't have a problem with it. But let's not sit here and act like they're just worlds apart. And let's be real, the only reason why Dante is talking about Mr. Fury like this is because he's mainly a Caucasoid. It just is what it is. Because if Tyson Fury was a black American fighter, he'd be talking about him way differently.
Even a Vitaly Klitschko in terms of skill or resume. You often hear...
Tyson Fury is better than what a Vitaly Klitschko was. He's better than what either Klitschko brother ever was. And a lot of people are not going to agree with that. It just is what it is. Both Klitschko brothers, in my opinion, were very decent fighters. Klitschko did not even win the biggest matchup of his career when he fought an older version of Lennox Lewis, an older version. Okay, so no, you cannot say that Vitaly Klitschko is above that of a Tyson Fury. Tyson Fury is, at least in my view, within the top 6 to top 7 heavyweights of all time. Just is what it is. Probably within the top 5. And a lot of people are not going to like that. I really don't give a damn. At the end of the day, once again, if you don't want to compare him to Rocky or Muhammad Ali or, Lennox Lewis, I don't have a problem with those guys. But if you're talking about Mike Tyson, Evander Holyfield, Riddick Bowe, Joe Frazier, George Foreman, all those guys that I just mentioned, yes, Tyson Fury's on those guys' level. He's around on their level.
The champions say it's hard to win a title, but it's even harder to keep the title. It's even harder to stay on top. We've seen the majority of the previous heavyweight champions do just that. Win the title and defend their belts on multiple occasions. We're not talking about just defending your title against Dillian White. We're talking about all of these young lions like Jared Anderson, Frank Sanchez, Joe Joyce, and the list goes on and on and on. So once again, if Tyson Fury or Usyk retires after they fight, they are making it very clear that Tyson Fury is no Lennox Lewis and Usyk is no Evander Holyfield. Usyk is obviously being compared to Evander Holyfield because Holyfield was a cruiserweight champion as well that moved up to the heavyweight division and became the undisputed heavyweight champion. The only difference is when Evander Holyfield became the champion, he stayed there and fought the most dangerous top contenders. Dangerous top contenders like Riddick Bowe, who beat him. And then Evander Holyfield came back and beat him in a rematch.
Yes, and then Riddick Bowe whooped his ass within the third match. But anyway.
So while it's clear that Tyson Fury is better than Deontay Wilder and Usyk is better than Anthony Joshua, what's not clear is we still don't know how great they are. We don't know how good they are. Because remember...
Well, I think the more appropriate statement, Dante, in my view, would be that we don't really know how great Oleksandr Usyk is because he hasn't really been around long enough. But once again, if you're a person that believes that Andre Ward is an all-time great fighter, or that a Joe Calzaghe is, or that a Tommy Hearns, now, of course, he won belts in more weight divisions. But once again, a lot of people, for example, they take a look at Tommy Hearns and they always love to call this dude an all-time great fighter. But really, besides the Roberto Duran win and overall, the controversial, draw in the Sugar Ray Leonard rematch, how many big wins did Tommy Hearns really have in his career? And I'm talking about 50-50 matchups. I'm not talking about when he beat Wilfredo Benitez or some of those other guys. I'm not talking about those fights. All right? So Tyson Fury, once again, he, in my opinion, is on that level. He's on the Andre Ward, Joe Calzaghe, Tommy Hearns level. That's where he is. Okay?
Teofimo Lopez, he beat Lomachenko. And George Kambosos beat Teofimo Lopez. Now look at where George Kambosos and Lopez are now in their career. My point is, getting one or two big wins in your entire career, it still doesn't really tell us how great you are. It tells us you're...
Well, that's understandable, Dante, but that comparison cannot really be made. And the reason why that comparison cannot be made is because Tyson Fury is a part of the heavyweight division. The heavyweight division is only going to have a certain amount of champions. When you talk about Teofimo Lopez and Vasily Lomachenko, those fighters are always usually going to have a little bit more to prove because they are within a multitude of weight classes. So if you're looked at as one of the best pound-for-pound fighters of your day and you're a Vasily Lomachenko or a Terrence Bud Crawford or a Canelo Alvarez, you're not only expected to do great within one weight division, you're expected to do great within a multitude of weight divisions. Okay? So it just is what it is. I understand Dante's point, but in my opinion, it's not the best of points. When we take a look at Tyson Fury not only is still undefeated, but every single A-grade fight that he has ever been in, whether it be Dillian White, whether it be Deontay Wilder, Vladimir Klitschko, he was able to beat those guys. Not only was he able to beat those guys, he was able to absolutely embarrass them, dominate them.
A good fighter. In Tyson Fury and Usyk's case, it definitely tells us they are Hall of Famers. But there's a difference from being a Hall of Famer and being one of the greatest of all time.
Well, I hate to break this to you, Dante. Tyson Fury is one of the greatest of all time. You can like that. You can not like that. It just is what it is. And a certain amount of people may not, even on my channel, would not agree with that. No, Tyson Fury is one of the greatest heavyweights of all time. It just is what it is. I don't think that there's really no debating it. I view Andre Ward and Joe Calzaghe, in my opinion, as all-time great fighters. I just would not put them within my top 10, maybe not even within my top 20. But they're, in my opinion, still all-time great fighters. They have the skills. They have the resume. They did what they were able to do for their era.
I mean, almost anyone can be a Hall of Famer. They even inducted Sylvester Stallone, just for his character as Rocky, into the Hall of Fame. So the bar is set pretty low when it comes to becoming a Hall of Famer. But the bar is set much higher.
I would somewhat agree with that, but once again, Tyson Fury, when we take a look at his career, it's very obvious that he has been able to come up in the big moments within his career. Okay? There was a reason why the Deontay Wilder fight was so big and why the Vladimir Klitschko fight was so big and why this Oleksandr Usyk fight could be very big as well. All right, so in my opinion, if Tyson Fury is able to beat Usyk and let's say he retires off into the sunset, he will pretty much have proved everything, in my opinion, that he has needed to prove. Now, whether in my view that is enough for you to vote him as the greatest heavyweight of all time, That's up to you. In my opinion, what that will do is, though, in my opinion, is that will at least secure him within my top 5 of all time. Because besides Rocky Marciano, Lennox Lewis, and Muhammad Ali, who really, in my opinion, is definitively above a Tyson Fury? Almost nobody. You know, I'm sorry, but neither the Klitschko brothers can be there. Mike Tyson certainly can't be there because he never won any of his real true 50-50 test fights. Evander Holyfield, maybe, but I'm not really even sure if I would put him there. He had several losses in his career when it came down to it. He's not undefeated like a Tyson Fury, and he was not as dominant as a Tyson Fury, in my opinion. Now, some people may debate that, but it is what it is. Joe Frazier, great fighter, would not put him on the same level as the Tyson Fury. George Foreman, maybe you could debate that one. In my opinion, that's where Tyson Fury is. He's in that George Foreman, Evander Holyfield range. Debating for, number 4, number 5, number 6. That's where he is. Okay? But anyway.
When it comes to being considered one of the greatest heavyweights of all time, or one of the greatest fighters of all time. Because at the end of the day, you can't name me one of the greatest heavyweights that did not defend his title multiple times. Just for example, the great Joe Louis. He was the heavyweight champion for over a decade, almost 12.
Right, but this defending titles argument, in my opinion, a lot of the times is so silly. Now, don't get me wrong, when it comes down to it, sometimes it does overall have some weight to the argument. But a lot of the times people mainly use that argument, especially when they don't like a specific fighter. I've seen the same thing when it came to Conor McGregor. Many people overall will try to debate you that Max Holloway is allegedly a greater fighter than Conor McGregor overall because Conor McGregor never defended his belt. Yeah, Conor McGregor apparently never defended his belt, but Conor McGregor at his best was at one point in time debatably the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter within the whole entire sport. So this defending title is bullshit. I mean, it's great to a degree, but Deontay Wilder defended his title 10 separate times. Pretty much against bums of the month. It just is what it is. So are you telling me that Tyson Fury is not on the same level as Deontay Wilder because he did not defend his title as many times? That's just not making any sense. Now, in certain regards, that makes a certain amount of sense, but let's just not sit here and act like Muhammad Ali and Joe Louis especially. Let's not just sit here and act like every single time they defended the title, it was always against some dude that was completely undefeated or overall someone who was just, the next lion in a row, because that's not what always happened. Okay, in fact, when we take a look at it, a lot of heavyweight title defenses usually don't go against that elite of fighters. It just is what it is.
Years. That's how long he held the title. Constantly defending his title against any and everyone. The truth is,
no, not against any and everyone, because Joe Louis, when it came down to it, a lot of the times, apparently, he would not fight the black fighters of his day. And then eventually, when he would fight them, at least one of them, I believe, he lost. Joe Louis actually is one of the more overrated fighters within the history of boxing. Don't get me wrong, still a great fighter. In the debate as the greatest heavyweight of all time, no.
A lot of heavyweight champions come and go. They won the title and they were quickly forgotten about because they did not have a long reign as a heavyweight champion. And the reality...
Well, sometimes, Dante, but a lot of the times, and if you're talking about a guy like a Riddick Bowe or someone overall like a Buster Douglas or something like that, and those two fighters aren't really on the same caliber, or maybe like a Vitaly Klitschko, those guys are also not remembered for having any definitive A-grade wins in their career or no more than one. When we take a look at Tyson Fury, if Fury is able to get this Oleksandr Usyk win, that will be 3 A-grade wins, 3 definitive A-grade wins, probably 4, because Dillian White would probably have to count on there as well, at least as an A- fighter. So let's not try to poo-poo Tyson Fury's resume, but let's be real, we all know why you're trying to do that.
Is if Tyson Fury and Usyk didn't have the complexion for the protection, they would...
Boom, there it is. There it is right there. And that is what this is all about. Dante's Boxing Nation does not want these guys to be remembered as the greatest heavyweight of all time because he does not want them to be a threat as the debatable greatest of all time. That's why he always tries to tear down Canelo Alvarez recently now as well. Because he does not want a Caucasoid or some other fighter overall than that of a black American fighter to be the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter. That's all this is about.
Be quickly forgotten about as well if they do what they're planning on doing, which is once again become the undisputed heavyweight champion and then retire. That's all I got for now, guys. I'm on to the next one. All right, now check this.
But anyways, that's really about it for today. I just thought that I would talk about that because I found that very particularly interesting. But anyways, that's really about it. We will see what happens with this fight. In terms of both of these gentlemen, I believe in my view that Tyson Fury already is somewhat an all-time great fighter. And if he is able to win this fight, in my opinion, that will really put the cherry on top. So we'll see. I don't know what happens. But anyways, that's really about it. This fight is very, very particularly interesting. In my view, do I believe that Usyk stands, a great chance over Fury? I'm not going to say that he stands a great chance, but you never know. He is a smaller guy. He is a person that can move around the ring quite thriftily. He is a person that is very, very quick. He's a boxer that is very, very good. So all in all, we'll see what happens. Actually, he's a great boxer, but we'll see what happens. But Tyson Fury, he might just be a little bit too big and a little bit too skilled for someone like an Oleksandr Usyk. But we'll see what happens. But anyways, that's really about it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.